Welcome to Stories of Brisco and Bradshaw. I would be Bradshaw. That would be your Chickasaw native, your Chickasaw Hall of Famer. He's so damn famous. He's going in another Native American Hall of Fame. He didn't even know about it until he did some research and found his name. That is Mr. Gerald Brisco. I'm Bradshaw, and we have got a treat today because we have got the greatest wrestling book in the history of wrestling, about the greatest draw in the history of wrestling, about the greatest wrestler in the history of wrestling. Mr. Jim Londos had a forward there written by John Bradshaw Layfield. What an honor it was for me to be able to do that for my friend Steve Johnson, because the book I saw and read, one of the best books I've certainly ever read. Steve, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, guys, for having me on. I appreciate it very much. And I noticed you didn't cover up your name when you had that book out there in front of the camera. You made sure to accentuate the John
Yeah, that's right. I covered up everything else. I just
That's right.
left John Bradshaw Layfield on there, wherever it is.
Steve, what were you thinking when you asked John Layfield to do the forward on a shooter like Jim Londos, man?
That's a good question, but I'll give you the honest answer. Knowing John, knowing his respect for history, knowing he's a smart guy. He's not going to try and come across like that.
What?
He was really my only choice to do that, because I thought that he could tie together what happened 100 years ago to the wrestling of today, and really show how this stuff is relevant. Even though it looks ancient, it has as much applicability today as it did then. So, John, did I put you over enough there?
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. You shut up that dang Oklahomian.
Hey, Steve, you're right. I mean, on some parts of your evaluation of John.
What do you mean some parts?
The thing that I admire most about you, John, is your love for the history of our business. And you're not that old of a guy. You're not up there with me. But we go back and we'll start talking history of the business. I'm shocked sometimes John's knowledge. He does so much research on the history of our business. If you're starting this business and you don't have the same passion that John has for a business, maybe you should look for another occupation, because the more you know about our business, the more you realize that what you're doing out there, you weren't the first to do it. You weren't the first to try this. You weren't the first to try a lot of things. John and I always laugh when somebody says he was the first in business to John. So, well, how about in 1849 when somebody did this? And I mean, he's right on the money. So that's what I respect about him. That's what we really admire about you historians that are in our business, that put our history out there, because our business has been so shaded for so many years. It just seemed like they pulled a damn curtain on us. Don't say anything about the history of that business. The business began in 1983, and let's move forward from there. But it was 100 years before that there. And we're thrilled to have you on our podcast to tell some of those stories.
Well, you're right. So many people think the business started in 1983, 1984, when Hogan beat Sheik, and that was the beginning of wrestling. The other problem we have, and it's a problem with this book, is if you go back and try and look at wrestling in the 20s or 30s or 40s, it's like trying to get information out of the old Soviet Union. People are airbrushed out of photographs, records disappear. This guy never existed. And trying to put it all together is like a jigsaw puzzle, kind of with holding one hand over your eye.
What do you think that is, Steve?
I think the large part is that until about the mid to late 30s, in Londos' period, wrestling was taken as a serious sport in the sports pages. And we have some of that in the book. Now, admittedly, that was tongue-in-cheek at times, but wrestling morphed into more of the entertainment side than the legitimate sports side. And I think people became very dismissive of it, especially sports writers, faded from the sports pages, made the newspaper. If it made the newspapers at all, it was back amid the tire ads. You remember that from your own career. And out of sight, out of mind, it became kind of almost a farcical kind of thing that wasn't taken as seriously as it was taken in the days of Strangler Lewis and Jim Londos. And that's unfortunate. It's taken in a different way now. I can't turn around without seeing a wrestling match going on somewhere, but there's still not an understanding that this is something that has evolved over a period, not just of years, but of decades. And if we're going to understand where we are today, it really helps to look at where we came from 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Steve, one thing I was just absolutely blown away on your book was the amount of research that was done on this book. And like you say, it had to be incredibly hard because guys, I'm not saying they're lying, but they would fabricate, crowd sizes. They would fabricate what happened in the finish because they're protecting somebody. Famously, the Briscoes and the Funks, they'd wrestle the same match, but they'd have a different finish on the same tape. So they'd show one in Florida and they'd show one in Amarillo, so wrestling has always, had this mystique because it needed to, because it's theater. But you to get to the bottom of all this stuff, how much time have you spent on this book? Because it is the best research book I've ever read on wrestling.
The first time I contacted Jim's daughter and said I was interested in doing a project on her was, I think, the final year of the George W. Bush administration. We're three or four presidents away. But it's taken that long to kind of get everything together, to fact check everything once, twice, three times, to get the information from Greece, the Greek newspapers, and translate it and put it into an understandable form of English here. It's been a massive research project. I joke that I have, for better or for worse, a PhD from the University of Virginia, and my PhD dissertation, this makes the Londos books makes the dissertation look like, run, Jane, run, see Dick, run.
What was it? Two questions. One, I think I know the answer to, but obviously that's why you asked the question, because you're not sure. One, was it worth it? And two, was it the right topic? You spent a good part of your life on this. This is kind of your life's work, or one of the biggest things you've done in your life. Was Londos the right topic?
He was the right topic, but I didn't know that at the start. At the start, let me backtrack a little. John Capuya, really good writer, had written a book on Gorgeous George.
Oh, it's a fantastic book. I've got it right here somewhere. I love that book. Next to your book, that's my favorite book in wrestling. I love that book on Gorgeous George.
It is, and it positioned Gorgeous George as kind of the counterculture bad guy of the post-war era, because from Gorgeous George, even today, flows Dennis Rodman and Floyd Mayweather and Deion Sanders. Those are all Gorgeous George was the antecedents of that bad boy sports culture. But George's story does not end well. He battled alcoholism. He died at an early age. If you were looking for a Disney family movie, he probably would not be an ideal subject.
Right.
And so I kind of started working on Londos, because here's a guy who had a 45-year career as a wrestler.
Wow.
Retired, was rich, owned a hill and property outside of San Diego, wonderful wife, wonderful kids. It's much more of a Disney storybook ending. I didn't know that when I started. When I started, I was just looking to say, hey, who's this guy and why should we care about him?
Well, stop right there, Steve. That's a question too. I'd like to. Why Jim Londos? What did he stick out in your mind? I mean, you're obviously a very bright gentleman, and did he stick out in your mind when you're becoming a fan of professional wrestling? How did you end your research on this man?
It was more digging in that period of the 20s and 30s and looking at what an anomaly he was. Okay, because all the great wrestlers of that era were big, strapping, all-American farm boys from the Midwest. Frank Gotch and Strangler Lewis and Joe Stetcher. And now all of a sudden comes this guy, 5'8", maybe on his tippy toes, 200 pounds on a Dean Malenko sized is the best way to put it. And all of a sudden, he's become the biggest draw in wrestling. He's being written up, biggest draw in sports. He's being written up in the New Yorker, for heaven's sakes.
Wow.
That piqued my interest as to how he got to that point and why people took such a fervent interest in him. It was a great period for sports, that period was. Cinderella Man, James J. Braddock, Seabiscuit, Babe Didrikson, Bobby Jones, the golfer, Bill Tilden, the tennis player. All those guys and gals were really important at that time. But when I went back in the newspapers and the archives and the research to see that Londos was as big or bigger than any of them, then that got me interested to say, hey, what the heck? Wrestling was big. Wrestling was as big as prize fighting or horse racing back then, and this guy was leading the charge. Let me find out a little bit more about him. 13 years later, you have the results sitting behind you on the shelf.
And to give a little perspective about it, you sent us some notes that was very helpful. But Babe Ruth, who I love, king of baseball, Babe Ruth was making $80,000 a year at his peak, making $35,000 a year when Londos made $185,000 a year. Wow. I mean, that is just insane that you had this guy. I mean, before we get kind of into Jim Londos himself, the greatest draw of all time. Now, no offense to Hogan and Stone Cold, you're comparing great to greater. You're not saying those guys were awesome. And Steve, I'm in a house right now because of Steve Austin. I love Steve Austin for that reason. And Hogan, because Hogan set the plate for us. But Londos, the greatest draw of all time, right?
He's not doing it. He's drawing on the basis of being Jim Londos. He's not drawing it on the basis of being a wrestler with the WWF or WWE or
Great
NWA
point.
or AWA. This is all Londos. He's not doing it on the basis of TV interviews or, hulking up for the camera. He's doing it on the basis of word of mouth and stories in the newspaper. He's not doing it by traveling across country, wrestling in New York in the afternoon and Chicago in the evening because he's hopping a plane. No, he's going out to the train station and catching a train to the next town to wrestle there. The impediments that he faced to become that kind of draw are remarkable. We talk about guys paying their dues today. I can't imagine guys would be willing to pay their dues like he did, coming over from Greece on a steamship and working his way up.
And one of the main reasons that he paid those dues was because he didn't have a benefactor, right? So he didn't have anybody in business. He didn't have an agent. He didn't have anything. He just came in. All of a sudden, he's this guy who came out of the circus, good-looking guy who learned how to wrestle very well. And he worked his way up legitimately, but he didn't have somebody saying, hey, I want to push him like Strangler Lewis or Joe Stetcher or Toots Montt or anybody. He was on his own, right?
He's his own promoter. He's his own barnstormer. Wow. He's creating whatever opportunities he can. He's wrestling early in his career in sideshows, for peanuts. He didn't have, until a little bit later on in the 30s, he didn't have a whole institution behind him. And the only reason he got the institution of wrestling behind him is because they saw what he could do in terms of drawing power. Once they saw that, everybody fell in line behind him, and he became the most influential wrestler to his time and probably since then as well.
That had to be so difficult to do because of just a lack of medium out there to get the word out about Jim Londos. I mean, he had to be very bright in the world of promotion and advertising and just about every facet of the game. Not only that, but be able to keep up with his body and his style of work and the training and everything. But before we get real heavy in there, Steve, tell us a little bit about you. Let's get into your here. How did you become such a suit wrestling fan and want to cover the history of our business? What was your introduction to professional wrestling?
I grew up outside of Buffalo, New York, and we were blessed because we got wrestling on TV from Toronto, Vancouver, New York City, Buffalo, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, got all different styles of wrestling. So when I was a teenager, instead of chasing the opposite sex or even leaving the basement for that matter, I'm sitting there watching 5 different styles of wrestling. And what intrigued me were the stories, because fundamentally that's what our business is about, right? Telling stories.
Yeah.
Londos told great stories.
Great.
That got me fascinated. Wrote a few things for the magazines. Wrestling really, writing about wrestling really got me into journalism, taught me how to write. I'm indebted forever for the ability to learn how to write by reading Sonja Henie's articles, fictionalized as they were in wrestling world. Said, man, this is great writing. I want to write like that. So long career in newspapers and journalism, never lost the interest for wrestling, and been writing about it on a very regular basis now for the last 20 to 25 years with Slam Wrestling, various books. The first book Greg Oliver and I did on tag teams will be 20 years old, come up this year, and probably needs to be dusted off and updated. But I enjoy the stories. I enjoy the people. And more than anything, I don't want to give you a list of results or championships you held. I want to tell people who you are. Why should we care about this guy?
Yep.
You know, not everybody who held the championship, everybody who won all their matches is that interesting. But there's some folks underneath the surface, maybe they were mid-carders or entry guys who have tremendous stories to tell, and people need to know about them. That's what really fascinates me.
Steve, I'll tell you an interesting story. When I first started doing commentary about that, has an integral thought in wrestling, period, is who you are. So somebody had done a move or something, and I called the move, and Vince was in my ear, and he was always very pleasant to me, contrary to all the reports of yelling at people. He didn't yell at me. He did yell at Michael Cole and JR. But he never yelled at me or Booker or King. He always treated us different. I guess because we had been in the ring so long or whatever it was. I'm thankful of it. But he got in my ear. He goes, "John, it's not radio. I know it's a drop kick. No one cares if it's a drop kick. Why did the person throw it, and why do I care that he hit somebody else?" And that was one of the greatest insights I've ever had in wrestling was, he's right. I don't need to call, people can see the moves. I need to tell them why they should care about these individuals, because that's what draws money. It's such an integral thought, and what you dictated so well in your book with Jim Londos.
Yeah, I was very careful in writing about this. We always talk about wrestlers making fans believe. Okay. Gerald remembers the Johnny Valentine quote. I can't make him think it's real, but I can make him believe. Something to that effect. I think that's okay.
I can make them believe what I do.
Exactly. And that's cool, but I would, for Londos and a lot of wrestlers of that era, I would change the phraseology just a little bit, not to make them believe, but to make them care. They don't, because there's a difference between believing and caring. You don't have to believe that every single move in the ring was absolutely real and that this guy, is bleeding or being stretchered out because it was real, but you need to care about them. And Londos, in some of the comments in the book that I was able to dig up, made it very clear that what he was interested in was establishing a performance that made people care. Again, that's distinct from belief. Yep. And I think that's part of why he was so successful. Is he understood that very fine distinction in a way that a lot of wrestlers don't.
And one thing you had in your book that I thought was so interesting, and that's such a great difference in believe and care, and I agree with you completely, but that's the essence of our business, was that Londos never wanted to shoot in the ring in front of people. He didn't mind to shoot because he was a tough guy, but he said, if you want to shoot, we'll do it in the gym with nobody around. He said, we're not going to ruin a crowd by having a shoot. So he was all about the performance, and it wasn't to him a matter of who's tougher or not. He didn't mind finding out who was tougher. He was just not going to do it in front of people because it was boring.
Right. You look at one of Gerald's old friends, Danny Hodge, and Danny would get in the ring and maybe test you a little bit with a move here or there. And I may be understating that. And that's okay. That's cool. But there was no need, Londos thought, for establishing who was tougher. I don't want you to know I'm a tough guy. I want you to know that I'm a performer. I'm a performer who happens to wrestle. But you're right. I have a couple of quotes in the book, John, that say if you wanted to meet Londos at 4 o'clock in the morning in the gym, he'd be there, and you'd be tied into knots by 4:05.
Right. One thing I just watched, I can't remember the gentleman's name. He's wrestling Abe something. It's a video on YouTube right now. You probably know who it is. I can't remember his Abe's. I can't remember Abe's last name or first name. Anyway, I want to see the airplane spin that Londos did, and I found one online. I'll send it to you, Jerry. It's like a 55-second encapsulation of highlights of the Londos match with Abe something, and it does the airplane spin. That's the worst thing I've ever seen. I mean,
that was my first finishing hold too, by the way.
That's right. Here's this shooter of all shooters, this great draw back when wrestling was real, and he's doing this horrible, hokey airplane spin. I mean, it's just, I love it in the preposterousness of it that you can make people care. Do they believe? Doesn't matter. Do they care? Is there 60,000 people here? He certainly did it.
But you'll notice at the same time, if you watch him with the airplane spin and some other body slams, they didn't protect each other back then the way they protect each other now.
No, they didn't.
Those were rough bumps.
Yeah. Yeah. And he did a couple of headlock takeovers that looked like he pulled 3 vertebrae out of the guy's neck.
He did.
You're talking about Hodge and everything in the airplane. Like I said, that was my first finishing hold. And Hodge is the one that asked me, "What are you doing that hold? What are you doing the airplane spin?" I said, "Because it's kind of cool and I like it." He said, "It doesn't with your work. It doesn't go along with anything that you do in the ring." And then so Hodge is the one that worked with me on a abdominal stretch and falling backwards, and like into a guillotine. And I from that airplane spin, I could easily, slide them down and get the stretch on them and then fall backwards into. But Hodge is the one that kind of, why are you doing that? I mean, and this is a move that was invented by our master,
That's right.
Jim Londos there. And I used to ask Hodge, why do you go out there and do you test the guys? He said, so I know the level that I need to adjust my work to. So that was one of the reasons why Hodge went out and kind of shot the first couple of minutes, so he could find out the guy's level, so he could adjust his work to what the guy could do in the ring. So, there was a psychology behind Hodge all the way through it.
That's interesting. I never heard that about Danny Hodge or about any of these old shooters, but that's why they would test some guys, because they never did make the whole match a shoot. They would just test you a little bit just to see if you see if you'd fight back.
Yeah. They want to know what kind of effort they were going to have to put out. Old Jim Londos. I mean, we would have never got the man if he hadn't have been disgruntled with his father, and he got on that ship and decided to come to the U.S. You want to fill us in on a little bit about Londos originally coming to the U.S., or just as the time frame before he was looking at the business?
That was something I didn't really know about until I got deep into the research. He had a problem with his dad. He and his dad did not get along. I'm exempting you and Wes from this, of course, but there's how father and son relationships can be. But if you and Wes did, I can't imagine Wes hopping a steamship to go 3 weeks across the Atlantic to another country.
Yeah.
Londos did. He, at 15, the age of 15, he was part of that generation of Greek youths that emigrated to the United States in search of, a better life.
But now, Steve, let me cut you off for just a second. That blows me away, because he was like 13 when he first ran away from home, and then he's 15 when he leaves. I mean, that is a kid in every sense of the word, and he's leaving to go get on a ship as a grown person who has to take care of himself. I mean, that's a backbone right there. That's different from what we see in the world today with all these freaking snowflakes.
Yeah, it is. It's stunning to think. And he did have a cousin.
John, say we're gonna get bumped off the air after he calls.
That's right. That's right.
Everything
goes back to snowflakes.
Well, he was no snowflake for sure. He did come with a cousin across the Atlantic. But if you think about a 15-year-old in steerage class coming across the Atlantic on a steamship at a time, when steamships across the Atlantic, safe passage was not always guaranteed. Bad things could happen. And he's coming to America. He has $20 in his pocket. He doesn't speak English. He goes through the Great Hall at Ellis Island. He's supposed to hook up with his brother, but he didn't want to hook up with his brother. He just took off. It's an amazing story. I can't imagine any parent of any 15-year-old going along with that. But it says to me, when I kind of worked through that part of the book, what confidence he must have had in himself to be able to go to a foreign land without any particular benefit and say, I'm going to go here and I'm going to establish myself and I'm going to realize whatever it is that I want to realize. That is stunning, but it also, I think, sets the tone for the rest of his wrestling career. We talk about determination in athletes all the time. That's determination with a small d. This is determination in capital letters. Okay? Nothing was going to sway him. Absolute self-confidence, patience, determination, and above all, persistence. Those were his qualities. And ironically, it seems to me those are the qualities that make the best wrestler.
Yeah.
And that's what he ended up doing.
Did he have much education?
He went through about the equivalent of what we would call 8th grade in Greece. And no formal education after that. Later in life, he expressed regret that he didn't go to college or didn't have advanced studies, but he possessed a fine library of books, liked to read, was very much self-taught, was very well educated on a self-taught basis in the classics and the Plutarch type of stuff that you would expect that you would ordinarily pick up in Greece as a youth. So I would say he was educated. I wouldn't say it was a street education. I just would say it was a self-education, being experienced of traveling around the world, going to foreign lands, learning foreign languages, meeting foreign leaders, being hailed as a dignitary in foreign countries. All that not only made him aware of his surroundings, but it probably increased his ability to analyze people, see how they would react, because he was a master psychologist, and in being a master psychologist in wrestling and in sports, also a master educator, teaching people to react the way he wanted them to react.
And also the logistics of what he did had to be astronomical. I mean, to deal with, I saw in your book 120 to 130 matches one year, which is an unbelievable amount because you're traveling by train and you're wrestling on these hard rings that have no give to them, and wrestling hour or 2 hour matches and pretty stiff matches. I mean, it's just an amazing schedule, but it's also an amazing logistics problem of having to deal with 120 to 130 different promoters. So he's having to tell somebody in St. Louis, I'll be there on Thursday. I'll wrestle this match. Here's the amount of money. Here's what I'm going to do. Then here's the promotion I'll do. Then I've got to be in X. I got to be in Kansas City after that. And here's the money for that. That is a logistics nightmare to be able to do that. That's a very smart man to be able to do what he did.
It is, to be able to balance your books like that. He had no Sam Muchnick doing his bookings for him. He had no Jim Barnett doing his bookings for him. He's doing that by himself, at least until he hires Ed White a little bit later on as his manager to kind of handle the formal tasks. Being able to do that and keep yourself in shape and meet all these dates and spend a little bit of time at least for reflection and understanding and refining your craft is a pretty amazing tool. He didn't have benefit of the WWE Performance Center. He didn't have the tutelage of a lot of older wrestlers who are going to show him what to do. To me, it's still amazing.
That's a great point right there. He didn't have the locker room to kind of, hey, watch my match, until they want to do it wrong.
And Jerry, nobody's going to help him.
Yeah.
You think about it. Here's this good-looking young kid, and the last thing some old guy is going to do is help that kid. I mean, you occasionally get the benevolent old guy, which you do now.
It had to be the same as it is now.
Sure.
We see one of these young, good-looking studs walk in the dressing room. My man, I got to pick up my game. I mean, I can't imagine what it was like. Here's this young Greek guy who did, good, like you say, a very strikingly handsome guy. Come in with a body that was just a deluxe body, and all of a sudden you're looking, man, I got to help him out. Come on, who's going to help me out?
It is. And remember, we're talking about the 20s and the 30s, and excuse my language, but I'm sure the reaction from some of these wrestlers, well, it says it in the book, was, here's that GD Greek.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah, he's in a very anti-immigrant time, which is another thing about him. That was during the Jim Crow era, the segregation era, and all this anti-immigrant wave, and he's the biggest star in the freaking world. It's just shocking what he did, and he's not a big guy. He's a good-looking guy, but he's not a big guy.
5'8". When you said 5'8", I was blown away. I knew he was a short guy, but I didn't know he was 5'8". But what was his intent? I mean, he come over. Was he already in the wrestling game, Steve, when he came over? Or did he come over with the intent to get in the wrestling game? How did all that play out?
That was one of the things that I worked for years on, and I finally, maybe about 3 or 4 weeks before I was going to send the publication, and got a couple of leads. He came over, landed in New York, didn't want to hook up with his brother, took off to Chicago. The fellow he came over with had been to Chicago before, and they had, when you emigrated at that time, you had to have a sponsor, had to list a sponsor on your immigration papers. They listed a sponsor who owned a fruit stand in Chicago. Don't know anything more about him other than that, but Londos did end up in Chicago. In Chicago, and again, he's 15 years old now, 15 going on 16. He bunks with two friends that he knew from Greece who had come here a couple of years earlier in one of these refugee resettlement areas. Lived with them in their apartments, the Soter brothers. One he went with, and then there was another brother involved. They had just built a brand new gymnasium at the resettlement complex outside of Chicago. And one of the Soter brothers was an avid runner and would go over there and run every day on the track. Londos, not having a job at the time, and he's Chris Theophilus at that point, but not having a job, he would follow him over to the gym, and he got fascinated with the wrestling. Sat there for hours on end watching the guys wrestle. Went back to the apartment, threw a mattress on the floor, and against these brothers would practice the wrestling moves that he saw there. That was really the beginning.
He was the first backyard wrestler.
Yeah, it was
apartment wrestling. Apartment wrestling.
That's right. It was like after his old mags.
It was a different kind of apartment wrestling.
After was there to cover that thing too.
Yeah. After it only been 30 years.
That was before cameras, so he just had to ride.
That's right.
But that's where he got hooked on it. That was the beginning of his fascination with wrestling.
And how did he end up? I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, he eventually hitchhikes his way to California and sees his first pro match with Stanislaus Zbyszko, and is totally hooked on it. That's what I intend to do. That's what I want to do. And just to circle back to what we said earlier, that's when he notified his father that he intended to be a pro wrestler, and his father said, "Well, you're not my son anymore.
Ugh.
So long."
What a horrible thing to do. Here's a kid who went to America. He's 15 years old. He should be in 9th grade. And he's ran off because he doesn't like the father. And the father sends him something back like that. I mean, that's a pretty rotten thing to do.
It tells you why he got on that boat, though.
That tells you why. That's right. That tells you why he got on a boat in steerage class and went to Chicago and didn't want to meet his brother.
Yeah.
But he used that as a true wrestler would. He used that as motivation. And there's a great quote in the book that my Greek translator, who I'll talk about in a moment, found for me, where Londos basically used his father's disapproval as motivation to win the world championship. Because if he sees how hard I work and then I become world champion, will he realize how unfair he has been to me?
Wow.
That's not just regular fuel, that's rocket fuel.
Yeah. When did Londos end up in the carnival? And the reason I asked that is because he had the worst job ever, and that was the catcher. You know, the guys who catch the guys falling. You know, I was always a catcher in wrestling, you know, because I was a big guy. I'm not jumping off the top rope, but me and Ron used to catch all of them. The Hardys one time had some like stud belts or something they had. They come back one time, me and Ron had got scratches all over us from having to catch them and those belts hitting us and stuff. It was, but being the catcher was the worst because you get killed. How did he end up in the carnival?
Sure. When he started out in California, and again, he's 16 years of age, right around there. He worked for a while as an apprentice to an electrician, saw how dangerous working with electricity was, and decided he didn't want any part of that.
Oh, especially back then.
Yeah. Worked for a while in the mountains on the Pacific Railway line, lugging water, working as a section hand, sleeping in rail cars. Worked for a while running groceries in Chinatown. Didn't like any of those. Ended up, a circus performer named Jack Dodd ended up finding him in a gym and thought he'd make an ideal person in one of his acrobatic acts they used to do on vaudeville, going from theater to theater. And that's how he picked up on it. He was good looking, had a good body, perfect for that kind of thing, built wonderfully, 200 pounds, thick, low center of gravity, strong as an ox, definitely the kind of catching guy at the bottom of an acrobat act. And so he's doing that at the time that he's 16, 17 years old. Again, not making much money, doubling on the side as a model for art classes at the University of California, doing the thinker type poses.
I saw a couple of pictures there. I had Chimmer said that he got in that film.
If you look at the pictures of him when he's 16, 17 years old, and you're Hunter or somebody in WWE, you say, I got to sign this guy.
Exactly, yeah. Now, you mentioned the name Jack Gott. Is that the old Jack Gott that that was wrestling back in the days? Or
Yeah, Jack Dodd was a wrestler. Jack Donovan was his real name. Jack Dodd was a wrestler, worked with the Barnum and Bailey Circus. Uh, the line between wrestling and vaudeville at that point was very thin. Wrestling matches, but Carnival Wrestling had wrestling matches too, and that's why we really don't have complete records for all these guys because we don't know how many times they wrestled on a night going from town to town. Um, but Dodd was a good trainer, and when Londos first came to Jack Dodd, he was very muscle bound and thick. Dodd worked with him, kind of refined him to make him a little more agile, be able to move a little bit more, and become a better wrestler. He was instrumental in his career. He managed him, I think, for a couple of years in 15 and 16, not long after he turned pro. There's in the collection that his daughter, Londos's daughter, has. There's a beautiful signed picture from Jack Dodd to Jim, where Jim is inscribed on the back. Jack Dodd Donovan, my first manager.
Wow.
And from there, was the Dodd the one that trained him for wrestling, or was it Stanislaus Zbyszko?
There were really three guys who were instrumental in getting him going. Dodd was instrumental in training him for wrestling. Dutch Mantell, the original Dutch Mantell, who was close to Funk Sr., Dory Funk Sr., was to be gentle about, a promoter of the First Order, took a liking to him and started arranging events for him. And then there was another wrestler out west named Pete Bazookas, who was kind of a lowbrow swindler type. But he taught Londos kind of the streetwise tricks in and out of the business that you needed to know at that time, because you never knew when you were getting in the ring if you were going against somebody who was going to turn on you, pull someone and stunt on you. Right. Yeah. Those are his three great influences at that time. He loved Zbyszko, Stanislaus Zbyszko. He was his favorite wrestler. Later in his career, when Londos made it big, he walked to the ring in his cape, entered the ring carefully, and bowed with a sweeping wave to each side of the ring when he entered the center of the ring, which he copied from Zbyszko. Like Gerald was saying earlier, there's nothing original in wrestling. Zbyszko probably copied that from somebody else, but that's where Londos got his famous ring entrance, with the robe and the bow and the sweeping appreciation to the audience.
It's amazing he's learning the showbiz aspect of that at an early age. When back in there, as we discussed, there's a room full of shooters and everything, and he's kind of seeing, man, if I'm going to advance it, I got to get into this entertainment.
Hey, Jerry, put your mic a little closer to you.
Okay, is those influences, the guys that we're mentioning, about the entertainment part, because that's what I find fascinating in an era where it was a bunch of tough SOB shooters out there. Here's this guy come along that's really catching on, but he's catching on and he's changing things into entertainment style. Is that the influence that Stanislaus and some of these guys gave him?
That's the influence that I think of the vaudeville presentations. He did all kinds of things, and we call vaudeville, but the traveling carnival stuff. You learned pretty quickly when you were working on a carnival how to get a reaction out of somebody. Now, if you could incorporate that into your real wrestling, then you had something unique, and that's what he brought to mass audiences for the first time.
But you had a few guys. I mean, you had a few guys that were like the Terrible Turk. Yusef was one of the, I guess, the first big original heel.
First monster heel, yeah.
You had some guys that were starting to realize that, the show business part of this is where we're going to draw the money, right?
Yeah, you did. But Londos put it together and popularized it more than anybody did. And there's a line in the book, not to put in, but Damon Runyon was one of the great sports writers. And he's on the Mount Rushmore of sports writers. And Damon Runyon wrote that he would rather watch Londos lose than watch Frank Gotch win. And we know how big Frank Gotch was and his connections to Iowa, really the first pro wrestling idol in the United States.
Yeah.
And that's because Londos had that whatever it is, he had it.
Yeah.
That nobody else of that era had.
When Londos is working so much, we're talking about wrestling so much, so many nights. He had this great body, and you see some of this great old stuff. Jerry just sent me a great thing, a Farmer Burns workout. Which there's different stuff on the internet. It's really cool stuff to see what the training they did. Farmer Burns could hang himself by his neck. He had that strong neck that he built up through all kinds of different training, and he was light years ahead of his time. What was the training regime for Londos during that time? Because if you're wrestling 120 to 130 nights a year and you're on a train the rest of it, was just the wrestling enough for him? Did he just naturally have a body like that, or was there a lot of training also that went in?
He got worn down, and he says around 1928 that he got worn down. He was having trouble actually pinning people, even with an artificial count. He was having trouble holding people down. So he probably was more diet conscious than any wrestler of his time. There were only certain foods he would eat, only certain times of the day he would eat them, only certain restaurants he would eat at. So I think he made up for a lot of the loss of training that would be associated with that much travel by being careful about his dietary intake. If you look at a lot of wrestlers of that era and subsequent eras, as they get older, that 34-inch waist maybe to a 38 or a 40, and pretty soon you're the American dream. He watched what
and they do like I do. Give me that pair of shorts. Just put the 38 tag on it instead of the 46 tag.
Yeah. That's right.
I just sew a different tag in there. It makes me feel better.
That's a great.
Dusty used to cut off the Levi Stratus tag where it had your waist side on his blue jeans. You'll notice his blue jeans. He never had one of those tags on his blue jeans.
Really?
Really?
I love it.
You have to remember too, when he's traveling from hotel to hotel, these hotels in the 1920s are not equipped with a fitness center where you can work out. If you're going to do road work, you're going to go outside the front door and run up and down the street a little bit. If you're going to lift something, you're just going to lift whatever you can find in your room, or do fill a tomato can with cement and carry that along with you. It was tough in those days, but he looked good for an awful long time. When he took off that robe, men would be envious, and females whom he attracted in record numbers would ooh and ah. Yeah. And he understood that was part of his appeal, and he didn't want to get like Dusty or some of the guys who maybe got a little more hefty toward the latter part of their careers.
Some of the guys, we all did.
That's right. I was trying to be generous there.
And as he's coming along, and you mentioned a great point there, which the women. I mean, I just saw an ad that you have in your book here where women were admitted free. Was this the time where women weren't really coming to sporting events, and he kind of broke that mold, or how did that go?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is a time when being a woman and going to a sporting event was kind of frowned upon to begin with. So you would admit women for free if you increase your customer base. And then once you got a glimpse of this guy, I'm sure the woman who's coming with her husband is turning to her husband in the seat and saying, come on, you can't look like this guy at least a little bit. There was our friend Frankie Kane helped me a lot with this book, The Great Mephisto. Frankie knew Londos a little bit, and Frankie made, I thought, a great comparison that might bring it home to people today who don't quite grasp this. Frankie thought Londos was the Oscar de la Hoya of his day, the golden boy. Wasn't the biggest, might not have been the best fighter, but had that special magnetism to men and to women, where women would turn out to watch him, whereas they wouldn't come out for any other fighter in that particular field. And Londos was the golden boy. He was the golden Greek. So I think the comparison's a pretty good one.
I just saw a story because I was doing a little bit of extra research just before you got on. Oscar Robertson, the story. Have you heard of it on the train?
Yes, I have.
Tell Mr. Brisco the story. Have you heard this, Jerry?
Well, I don't know if it's true or not, though.
That's true. Oscar Robertson wrote it in his book, I guess, and not 100% sure if it's true, that he was sitting across from. Go ahead, Steve. I'll
Oh,
let
you
you.
go ahead. I'll tell you
So
where
Oscar Robertson, I just saw it, so it's fresh in my mind. Oscar Robertson, who was the great black baseball player, was sitting there on a train, and Jim Londos was right across from me, and he wanted to sit in a certain chair, and Jim Londos said, "No, that's saved for somebody." And Robertson took it as maybe he's being racist or something. Here's a Greek immigrant. So he's got as much discrimination against him too. And so Londos says, "No, I'm saving it for somebody." And Oscar Robertson tells him, said, "Well, you're either going to give me that chair or you're going out the window." And so right then, the one of the bellhops comes by and he goes, "Sir, can we talk to you?" And they told Oscar Robinson, said, "You have no idea. This is Jim Londos." And Oscar Robinson, his book put up, he goes, "I immediately thanked him and left."
I love it.
But he was that big a name that once, you didn't know who they were. He's playing sports every night. He's not reading the papers. He didn't know what Londos looks like. They didn't have TV back then. Yeah. And also, but he was such a big name that when the guy who's taking tickets goes, "Sir, you don't know, this is Jim Londos." And he said, "I immediately got up and left."
And assuming that's true, and I have no reason to doubt that Oscar would say that, it's just that that's one of those things that I want to double fact check on. Londos would have to have been pretty aged at that point, because Oscar, his career was really early 60s, and then
that's right.
Londos would have been at the tail end of his career, although I'm sure he was still training people, and there's comments in the book about folks he trained who just could not move him, strong as they might be in other veins.
When was the era? What years was it that Londos first started drawing crowds? When he started becoming a draw.
Yeah, first he started becoming a draw in the mid-20s. 22, 23, 24. He became something different than what people were used to. And he started to draw good crowds in the early to mid-20s. By 26, 27, he was probably drawing better crowds than anybody was, except he didn't have the championship because he was too small and too Greek. When he finally won the championship for the first time in 1930, then the crowds went from huge to just explosive. So it was kind of a gradual process. I don't think promoters realized what a draw he was until they'd kind of run out of other championship options. Because if you look at that period of time, if not Londos, I'm not sure where they turn. They'd gone through the Strangler Lewis and Joe Stetcher for probably 15 years at that point, and there weren't a whole lot of other alternatives other than Londos.
And Gus Sonnenberg had blown up a little bit by that point, right? As far as the expose on him really, really killed him.
Yeah, it did. And as we know, Gus Sonnenberg, although he introduced the flying tackle to wrestling and was very exciting, couldn't defend himself in the ring. And so he was always at risk of being double-crossed in the ring. And as we talked about it the last time we were here, nothing kills a business like a double cross. You need to have somebody in the ring who can at least handle themselves and escape if trouble looms.
And that's what happened a little bit in the late 20s, because in 25, I believe it was, you had Wayne Munn and Stanislaus Sabisco, the famous double cross that would have been terrific for Strangler Lewis, if not for Stanislaus Sabisco to either getting paid off, or it looks like, or whatever it was, to take the title off of Wayne Munn.
Yeah, going into business for himself.
And that really hurt business because you look at Londos. Londos came in as a savior of business many times. And that was one of the times that appeared to me that he did. After that screw job with Wayne Munn and Stanislaus Sabisco, business really took a hit. And Londos was one of the ones that started bringing it back. And then you had Gus Sonnenberg. Then they did the expose on Gus. He's wrestling the same guys just under different names. And they kind of killed him. Londos came in then too.
He did, and then take it further when Dick Sheekat shot on Dan O'Mahony in Madison Square Garden in 1936. Maybe the most important match in the history of wrestling. The business went totally into the tank. 18 months later, who do you turn to as the man who's going to resuscitate wrestling? At that point, a 44-year-old Jim Londos, and he did about as well as you could do under the circumstances. I think he carried with him a certain level of respectability and credibility that few people, if anybody else, had. And so when wrestling was down in the dumps, he became the statesman for wrestling. Even though folks understood there was a little bit of performance involved, when Londos spoke, they took him seriously. You were talking about that period around 27, 28, after the Wayne Munn fiasco, when wrestling was really in bad shape. Londos made it a point to go to sports editors at various newspapers in person, talk to them, show them holds, show them what a headlock was really like and how, this you can have some faith in what I'm doing in the ring, and just establishing a level of credibility with the business that it was in danger of losing. I don't know what would have happened if Londos had never appeared or if hadn't gone quite the way he did. It's easy to see that wrestling at that time was in trouble. Maybe it goes the way of the roller derby as kind of an interesting side thing that has its own little niche following, but never really cracks the public consciousness in the way that it did later on with Londos. It's interesting that a 5'8" Greek immigrant came over from on a steamship, became the first superstar immigrant in the U.S., and in the process, as a couple of folks say in the book, transformed, rescued, saved, whatever verb you want to use, put the business on a plane that it had never been on before, took it to heights it had never imagined before, and when it dropped off those heights, came back and brought them back to maybe not to quite the same height, but to where it had a degree of respectability. The periods in which Londos was gone on trips to Greece and the periods in which wrestling went down like that, perfect correlation. The periods in which Londos returned from Greece and the periods in which business picked up, perfect correlation. Can't say that about many wrestlers in history. Can't say that about many sports figures in history.
Right.
That's what I find amazing too. That like you described me, was the Greek immigrant comes in 5'8", and that he would have the credibility to sit down with all these credible journalists, from the New York Times, from the major magazines, even at the time, a New Yorker, and get mainstream audiences to interview him like that. For a guy, to me, without the media coverage and everything, he had to have that something, that special it that we try to describe. What the hell is it, and he had, but whatever it was, Jim Londos was one of the first to have it, right?
He carried himself in a particular way. Maybe Thez is a good later day example. He carried himself like a champion, There's no significant scandal attached to his name. When he looked at you, he was sincere. There was no tongue in the cheek like I'm doing that. Hey, we really know what this is all about, don't we? He took his business seriously. He worked at it. He perfected his craft. He was a statesman around the world, not just North America, but I can't even count the countries. Greece, Egypt, South Africa, England, France, Turkey, Australia, New Zealand, of course. The only place he really didn't wrestle of consequence was Japan. But of course, that's because his time frame in wrestling, we were at war with them. That didn't come to a little bit later on. But he became an ambassador for wrestling around the world. So when he could go talk to sports writers and say, here's the way they wrestle in France, here's the way they wrestle in Australia. They use a rounds system. Maybe a rounds system would work here in America. You can get onto a whole another discussion, almost philosophical, about the sport and the direction it's going, that just kind of added to that credibility that he brought when he's talking to folks.
And this is a guy with basically an eighth grade education.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. Now, when he went back to Greece.
Hey, Jerry, get a little closer to your mic.
Okay, when he went back to Greece, his reception over there had to be a Greek god, so to say. It's almost a guy that made it in the United States. All of a sudden, he's coming back to Greece. What was his return to Greece like, and who and why did he go back to Greece? Was it a competition or what?
Yeah, no, this is really the most fascinating part of the book, and this is stuff I had no idea I'd ever be interested in. But, and I'll throw in two names here, I had immense help from Professor Alexander Kitroff at Haverford University on Greek history. I worked with a wonderful translator and researcher in Athens named Vasiliki Moutzori, who helped me with Greek newspapers. I called her Vicky because I couldn't get past that name very well. Uh, but I had enormous help in trying to trace what Londos meant in Greece, because what he meant in Greece was what he meant in the United States multiplied multiple times. Um, he went back to Greece in 1928 for the first time, wanted to wrestle, see his aging father finally. They started to mend fences a little bit. Wrestled at the famous Olympic Stadium in Athens, the white marble Panathenaic Stadium. First professional to ever wrestle there. It had been exclusively a den of amateur athletics. So he did that tour in 1928, and he was greeted like a deity. Greece, throughout the early part of the century, had more than its share of troubles, losing wars, health issues, civil unrest, political unrest. And every time Londos went to Greece, the prime minister of Greece at that time made sure that he was photographed with Londos to get a little bit of what we in the West would call the rub. Okay?
Wait, a politician doing something like that? Stop it.
The politician. This is an amazingly popular man. I need to be seen with him. And Londos was not a geopolitical strategist by any means, but of course, that was very important. And after his first trip to Greece in 1928, he came back to the United States with a renewed belief that he needed to win the world championship, not just for himself and not just for his dad, but now for the people of Greece. There were great wrestlers around there at that time. John, you mentioned Gus Sonnenberg, Strangler Lewis, Joe Stetcher, Dick Shekat. All these guys were capable world champions, but none of them had the fate of an entire country resting on their shoulders. Okay? They're monitoring what Jim Londos is doing here in Greece on a daily basis. I told somebody a few weeks ago, describing the way Londos was treated in the Greek press, it was like Muhammad Ali and Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant and LeBron all rolled up in one. So dominant was he among Greek sports at the time. Then, not to belabor the point, he goes back in 1933 for a famous match with Cola Quariani, and that's the one that drew 90, 100,000 people. We know that the Olympic Stadium seated 60,000 people. We know that the gates were overrun. We know the ticket sellers tore tickets in two to sell as individual tickets. So we think there were about 70,000 people in the stadium at the time. There's some film on YouTube. If you look at it, you don't have any trouble believing it. We know there were 20 or 30,000 people on the hillside. The stadium is sitting down in a valley on the hillside looking down. So we know that there were 90,000 people, maybe more, watching a wrestling match. Nobody would do that in terms of an in-stadium attendance until WrestleMania 3. My goodness, that's 50 years later. Yeah. Nowadays, attendance records are broken every week or 10 days. That one stood for 50 years.
Yeah, and you didn't have audio visual, you didn't have big screens, you didn't have a PA system, you didn't have nothing. You just had guys if you're in the back, you could barely see those guys in the ring.
Sure.
I mean, if you paid a ticket and you were there and you were in one of the worst seats, you see two ants out there rolling around. You can't even tell who's who. It's so bad. It's that makes it even more amazing.
Yeah,
it is. But you're chanting, and all you hear the whole time is Zito Londos, Hosa Londos, long live Londos, long live Greece. And I know it sounds crazy here in 2025, but it's no understatement to say that the hopes and the dreams and the aspirations of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Greeks were on this 5'8" wrestler in a wrestling ring. That's something that I don't think we will ever see again.
And when one thing, Strangler Lewis and he had a bit of an animosity type relationship with each other, mainly, I believe, because of competition. But if you hadn't had that, if Strangler had been more of a benefactor to Londos, Londos may not have been a big a star, right? Because he had to do things like go to sports editors, he had to go to sports pages, he had to go to all this stuff. He had to do it all himself. If he hadn't had to do it all himself, he might not have ever become this huge star. So it's almost like a thank you to Strangler Lewis of he kept him down so much and kept the machine against him that Londos just simply by surviving, he had to create his own infrastructure and machine, which became the best in wrestling, right?
Sure, exactly. Superman needs Lex Luthor, right? Batman needs the Riddler, right? You need an antagonist and a protagonist to carry off a successful story in wrestling. And Londos and Lewis.
That's Vince McMahon philosophy 101 right there, what you just said. Steve.
Yeah, exactly. You need Mr. McMahon.
That's right.
Against folks. That's wrestling's telling a story, and that helps you to tell a story. Now, it helped that Londos and Lewis did not like each other. They were, Ali and Frazier. They just didn't like each other.
But it's not. I agree with you, but it's not exactly like it's Ali Frazier. It's like Ali Frazier as if Frazier or Ali controlled all the promoters.
Yes, that's exactly right. Lewis was very good with Londos in the early years and gave him a lot of matches. Never let him win, but there was a period starting from about 1924, 1934, where Lewis wouldn't get in the ring with him. And that kind of began wrestling's great Cold War between Londos and Lewis. And it almost was better that way, that they didn't get in the ring together. But again, going back to basic wrestling philosophy, you want to hold these guys apart as long as you possibly can. You don't want them to scuffle until they're ready. Now, they didn't scuffle until they were absolutely ready, and probably 3 or 4 years beyond when they should have
Right.
Because of the animosity level involved. But that just played into him. If you're just an average Joe sitting at home following wrestling in the 1920s, who are you going to care for? The guy who looks like you, who's 5'8", a working man from Greece, or a big guy named Strangler? Well, you know where your sympathies are going to lie. You can identify with the little guy, right?
Yeah.
And
that's the worst babyface nickname ever.
Yeah.
Strangler Lewis.
That's right. No, nobody named Strangler can be a babyface, and unless a really lousy promoter is turning him, which I wouldn't rule out. But that just kind of adds to the ability of Londos to play off Lewis, and then eventually set up what I wrote in the book was the match of the century, and was the match of the century between Londos and Lewis.
Man, and the way you set up this match of the century, and I agree with you, it was the match of the century. They say that a lot of times, but that really was. And it was so impressive to me. That was one of the most impressive things. And you wrote it in your book in such an articulate way that you could feel it. You could feel the entire thing that's going on at the time with Strangler Lewis and Jim Londos about what they're doing with the match. Londos put that match together in a way that made it look like a big match and look like a shoot. In fact, the newspaper reporters, which you have all documented in your book, I'm not trying to steal your story from you saying it, said that match was legit. I mean, it was so freaking good. Londos took out all the high flying, he took all this stuff to make it look like a shoot, like the match of the century. So when people look at it, if you're judging it, it's not going to be this quote 5-star match. But if you're looking at it and you're involved, you're going, that's the match of the century. That's the greatest thing I've ever seen.
What you're saying, Londos kind of changed his style to kind of fit in to make the match work.
That's right. He took out all the high flying. I'll let Steve took out all the high flying to make it look like a shoot.
Yeah, they're just grinding on each other, grinding. I thought it was a brilliant piece of work on his part, and Lewis's too. And I'll tell you, just from a writing perspective, John, I probably spent 3 months just trying to write three paragraphs on that, because I wanted to honor that match in the way it should be honored. Because
you did a great job on it. It was fantastic.
That was the match of the century, and you could have ended the book there in a way. That was the culmination of his career. I wrote in the book, I'm not giving anything away here, Lewis and Londos became such bitter rivals that when they wrestled, they were not wrestling for the championship of the world. They were wrestling for the championship of each other.
Wow.
And yeah, and when you put that much emotion into it, and there was certainly that much emotion on Londos's side, then if you have the ability to draw fans in and get them involved in something like that, oh, you don't have to do Hurricane Ranas off the top rope. You don't have to do triple backflips in the middle of the ring. You can just get in there and swap holds and grimace a little bit and move here and there. And the people are going to lock into it saying, oh man, that other stuff, yeah, that was okay. But this, I not only believe, I care.
That's right. And it's like the old Hitchcock used to say. Hitchcock used to say, there needs to be a bomb under the table. The bomb doesn't ever need to go off.
Yeah.
The anticipation of it.
You don't have to see the bomb.
That's right. And now when you see all these big matches now, and I'm not saying all of them, but some of them you see out there, first thing they do is blow up the table. Like, dude, you killed all this suspense.
The one thing I couldn't get at in the book, obviously, because Jim died 50 years ago next year. If I had one question to ask Londos, I would have liked to ask him, after the match with Lewis, the match of the century, Chicago, September 1934, you finally won after chasing him for 17 years. The referee held up Ted Toneman, the referee tapped you on the back, held up your hand. What went through your mind? Tell me honestly, what went through your mind? I think that would have been.
Yeah.
Nobody ever asked him that, or at least that's not recorded.
That's the question, because all the times he's sleeping on Pullman cars, all the time he's traveling around trains, Lewis is ducking him on purpose because he knows what a big draw he is. He's not going to give him the prestige of working with him and putting him over, certainly. And so that to me is something that he spent hours and hours and hours dreaming of. That's the question to ask. That would be something you'd want answered.
I would love to know what he thought, because that is, he still had a great career after that, but that's the culmination right there, and he had achieved it. And I wonder if in that instant, in that moment, he's thinking back to what you just said, John. I came over on a boat with some hopes, but no money and no particular aspirations. And here I have defeated my enemy, and I don't think enemy is too strong a word there. I have defeated my enemy in the most important match in my profession in history. Yeah. What's going through my mind? Whoa.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I would have found it overwhelming.
Against all the odds. And all the odds were against him. It can't be overstated. He had no benefactors. He had nobody that was helping him. It was literally him against the entire system.
And on that point, John, I mean, how was this match set up? How did they finally decide, it's time. It's time to make the Golden Greek the champion? I mean, what was the politics involved in creating that match? And who since Londos was kind of a factory of his own, who helped him set up all this business part of it?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's interesting because they've been chasing each other down for so long. And finally, in 1934, they reached kind of a détente, if I can bring in foreign policy into this discussion, Mr. Kissinger.
We got a great guy there. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. At that point in 1934, Londos is 40. Yeah. And he'd been chasing Lewis all these years, and he's figuring, I need a victory over Lewis to validate my career. I've been champion, I've drawn money, but the one thing I don't have is a victory over Lewis. Lewis is a little bit older than Londos, about 3 years older. He's past his prime. Lewis had the Dusty Rhodes view of spending money, which is if it's in your pocket, it's doing you no damn good. Lewis needed a payday. Finally, Ed White, Lewis's manager, Lewis kept challenging Londos. Ed White, Lewis's manager, blew him off until finally, after a match in Chicago, Ed White, Londos's manager, said, okay, let's talk. Let's talk about this. And the person who really put it together, this is what makes this so fascinating in the world of sports. The person who put this together was Arch Ward. Arch Ward was the editor of the Chicago newspaper. And if you hear that name, it's because in 1933, the year before this match, Arch Ward put together something called the Major League Baseball All-Star Game, first All-Star Game. And Arch Ward also put together, as editor of the Chicago paper, a football game between college All-Stars and the NFL champion. They don't do that anymore, but that was a big game back in our day.
Sure, it was huge.
So he was a guy who was looking for ways to involve the newspaper in sponsorship of something big. Nothing was bigger than this. And Arch Ward got a promoter's license so that he could actually promote the match of the century. There were a couple boxing matches on the card as well. So it kind of fit in with what the Chicago newspaper was doing at the time. It kind of fit in with where Londos and Lewis were in their careers. And the involvement of the newspaper was brilliant because the Chicago Tribune was syndicated to newspapers across the country. Newspapers now, my former profession, are a dying breed, but at that time you would get something from the Chicago Tribune that would be reprinted in hundreds of newspapers around the country. So that guaranteed more publicity for this match than any match in history. Newspapers that subscribed to the Chicago Tribune syndicate from Maine to Alaska to California and Texas were all running stories about the Londos-Lewis match coming up. So it gathered a national publicity, even though there was no TV or internet for publicity at the time. So it was really a confluence of factors. And then I think Lewis and Londos understood the importance of the match, and they conducted themselves on a scale that you would expect with that match. So many of our matches of the century in boxing or in other sports end up being pretty lousy. Wrestling had the advantage of being able to script it a little bit.
Right. Yeah, I was in college, and me and my buddies found $35 to buy Tyson versus Speaks, and everybody in the house was so
90 seconds later, you're pissed off.
Oh my God, we didn't have any money. We spent all our money on it, and everybody in the house going, "That was great." I go, "No, it wasn't. I spent all my damn money on this fight."
The game of the century and the match of the century usually does not live up to the hype. This one did.
Did this live up to the hype?
And this lived up to the hype. Just the fact that sports writers believed this was the real thing was a major feather in its cap. And for years, on the anniversary of the match, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, whatever the case may be, newspapers or wrestling magazines would go back with one of those "Remember When" pieces on how 25 years ago the match of the century occurred in Chicago.
Now, not Toots Mom, I was about to say Toots Mom, but Londos was on the receiving end of a screw job too, right?
Multiple screw jobs, yeah.
Which people, reading your book, it's just amazing to me. The book on, keep holding it up because people are taking out clips of this, but reading your book is just amazing to me. Two things: the amount of screw jobs and the amount of exposés done on wrestling business. I mean, this business was, people are like, "Oh, we got to protect the business." It's never been protected, ever.
Amen. I'm so glad to hear you say that, because they keep saying protecting the business even today.
Right.
No, it was exposed. The Wizard of Oz had the sheet torn from him long before Vince did anything with the state of New Jersey in the 80s.
Right. It was just amazing how often it was exposed. It wasn't like it was just annually. It was like almost every week you look at some newspapers exposing the business again.
And that gets back to the point we were making earlier, is whether you believe in it is secondary. Whether you care about it, that's the primary factor.
Right.
I can read in the newspapers that this is a setup, or this is predetermined, or something like that. I don't care. The movies I'm going to see this weekend with my wife are all the same way. I don't have to believe in them, but I can care about them. And as long as Londos could continue making people care about it with this unique fusion of sports and athleticism and theater, then the crowds turned out, regardless of how many times sports writers would insist, readers, this is fake, this is fake, this is fake. Okay, that's fine. I'm going to go see it anyway.
Now, how did during this time, because Jess McMahon, Vince McMahon's grandfather, they got the rights to promote Madison Square Garden boxing and wrestling. Of course, Vince McMahon Sr. Had the same thing, up until they, formed the WWF in 1963 with Bruno and Buddy, and then of course the ones we know as Mr. McMahon, the same thing in Madison Square Garden, not exclusive, but he ran the garden. How involved or interchanged was Jess McMahon or Vince McMahon Sr.? I know Toots Mondt later and Vince McMahon Sr. were together, but how interchanged was Vince McMahon, Jess McMahon, or Vince McMahon Sr. in this time period, and this all we're talking about?
Londos was really out of New York by the time Jess gained any kind of foothold. Londos's promoters in New York were primarily Jack Pfeffer, another quirky promoter, Ray Fabiani, his close friend, and Toots Mondt.
I
Jess
saw a
really
picture with him with Jack Curley too. With Jack Curley,
and Jack Curley was the Vince McMahon of his day as far as boxing and wrestling goes in the 20s.
Tremendous promoter. Yeah. He went boom and bust many times. What a great story.
Yeah, they all do. So Jess came along a little bit later on. Toots, I'm not convinced Toots actually died. I think Toots may still be living. He appears in every wrestling account in the 20th century, usually as the heel promoter, but he has an angle for just about everything. Was it, Gerald, you may remember, was it Lou Thez who said of Toots Mondt, he'd steal the cream off your coffee?
That was Lou, yeah.
That's right. So it wasn't a terribly savory bunch that Londos was dealing with. If some things haven't changed over the years, and the integrity of wrestling promoters is probably one of them. So Londos really last appeared in Madison Square Garden in 1935, and unsurprisingly, attendance and wrestling in Madison Square Garden dropped off the face of the earth, to the point where there was about a decade period there where there was not even a wrestling match in Madison Square Garden, which is hard to believe. The biggest and most important arena in the world.
That was all through Muldoon to doing, right?
Yeah, it was. And wrestling was gone from Madison Square Garden from about 38 to 49. So when you talk about the Jess McMahon influence on wrestling in that period of time, it's more weighted to the boxing side of things.
Now,
yeah,
and
okay,
just go ahead, John.
Go ahead, because Jess, I was just trying to put it all together. He had promotions. He promoted the Jack Dempsey fight in Cuba, with Jack Johnson, back in, I guess, the late 20s. And so he was around there that time, but I didn't know if he crossed with a lot of those guys, because I knew Toots Mondt later was a big deal with Vince McMahon Sr. And I believe Toots Mondt was one of the ones that helped arrange the San Martino Buddy Rogers event, wrestling match, whatever you want to call it, in Madison Square Garden.
Toots was quite a character, and I spent a little time on him in the book. He's probably a book in and of his own. He arranged for a double cross of Londos in 1933 in Chicago by Joe Savoldi. 5 years later, he's promoting Londos for the World Championship and calling him the greatest wrestler he's ever seen. Nobody even comes close. So if there was anybody good at working both sides of the fence, it was Toots Mondt.
Toots.
Yeah.
But now Londos came back. That's a pretty good story. Londos came back and confronted Mondt about it, and it was you can tell a story.
Well, he did. Londos came back. Londos went to overseas for about 18 months. Wrestling had a lot of trouble. Londos comes back, starts to pique interest in people. Mondt controlled the belt with Bronco Nagurski at that time. And Mondt wanted, it was either $25,000 or $50,000 to switch the belt from Nagurski to Londos. And Londos, businessman that he is, said at that time, it's not worth that much money. I'd like it, but it's not worth that much money. Eventually, in 1938, with the help of Ray Fabiani, the Philadelphia promoter who acted as an intermediary, Mondt and Londos and Fabiani got together and switched the title from Bronco Nagurski back to Londos. as world champion in 1938, and Londos never lost it again, never lost a fall again in a match. And was world champion from 1938 until the day he retired in 1959. Wrestling makes strange bedfellows.
That's brings in a question I was going to ask. When Londos wins it from Strangler, the world title, how did that change the business? Did it change the business? Did the people look at it a different way because you got an entertainer coming in, basically a guy that's changing the style of professional wrestling? How was it perceived, and was did he elevate himself into becoming a bigger star as a world champion?
The first time he won the world championship in 1930 in Philadelphia from Dick Sheekat in a Ray Fabiani promotion. Ray was Londos's close friend. Business just took off. And the way I describe it is before that point, wrestling had been black and white. After that, it was in color. You remember The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy's house lands on the witch, everything's black and white to that point. Then Dorothy opens up the door and walks out into this land of color. That's the kind of transformation he had. It was like an entirely new world. We have a champion who doesn't look like anybody else who's ever been champion, wrestling in a way that no one has ever wrestled, drawing fans, ethnic Greek fans, blue-collar fans, female fans, women in a way that nobody's ever drawn before. And I hesitate to use the word revolution, but it's certainly a transformation in the way wrestling viewed its champion and the way wrestling was viewed. And then concomitant with that is all of a sudden sports writers are seeing, hey, this guy is selling out houses everywhere across the country, drawing 20,000 people to Madison Square Garden. He's a story we got to write about. They write about that, and it becomes kind of whatever the opposite of a vicious cycle is, it becomes a positive cycle. The better he does, the more stories are written about him. The more stories are written about him, the more people want to see him. The more people want to see him, the more stories are written about him. Until at that point in the 30s, I have no trouble saying he's the most famous active athlete on a worldwide basis, and as well as John mentioned earlier, the highest paid.
Right. I see something. The only similarities to me are, a few times in history. I think now is a similar time in wrestling history because you're starting to see every celebrity in the world realize how big wrestling is, and they want to be involved. During that time, you had Bronco Nagursko, you had Primo Carnera, you had all these everybody wanted to be in wrestling because the money was so freaking big and Londos was so big. Now, the one thing that you point out that's very astute is that wrestling wasn't big then. Londos was big then. Okay. Now, you've got your great big stars, your Cody Rhodes, your Roman Reigns, but wrestling is also big. Back then, it was pretty much all centered on Jim Londos. But it's very similar as far as also kind of in the 90s, the late 90s Attitude Era, when you'd have all these stars would come in and they want to be part of the show because ratings were so high. It just seems like a very similar time between the late 30s with Londos and those other two time periods.
It is one of the really interesting things is that Londos didn't take full advantage of the crossover that he might have. He would do a few exhibitions in posing exhibitions or routines when he was champion, personal appearance type things. But he specifically disavowed the opportunity to work in movies, and motion pictures would have loved him.
Why that was? Why he didn't like?
Yeah, he didn't. He says specifically that he felt standing in front of a hot camera all day, striking poses, wore him down in a way that he wouldn't be in tip-top shape for wrestling. I can't imagine too many wrestlers who would pass that up in this day and age, but he felt it would affect his primary pursuit. He just didn't want to go.
Was this more bigger than movies, though? I mean, was the business bigger than movie business at that time?
Yeah, a lot of wrestlers went to California so they could play bit parts in movies, be part of the Screen Actors Guild, get their card and so forth. But he specifically rejected overtures to appear in motion pictures and to do a lot of commercial endorsements. He didn't smoke, didn't drink, only ate particular foods. You could not have gotten him to endorse, I don't know, Slim Jim, for example. He wouldn't snap into a Slim Jim. He's very
He wouldn't
particular.
have been a Marlboro man then.
No, he wouldn't have been a Marlboro man, but he's very particular about his name and the use of his name and his image.
Wow.
So there were opportunities, commercial opportunities available there that he just kind of disavowed.
One thing I want to go back to, when he had the screw job by Toots Mondt, he came back and confronted him in the dressing room, right?
Yeah, he confronted Mondt. He confronted a lot of people who tried to derail his career and gain control of the scene. Never another guy was old Joe Carroll. Old Joe Marsh was another guy he had a run in with. They think he's the only guy he physically actually did anything with in the dressing room. But he understood that he would be able to get his own eventually. I think I wrote in the book somewhere about Ed White, Londos's manager. No final victories, no final defeats. That's the way you had to approach wrestling in those days. Your ally today might be your enemy tomorrow, and vice versa. And I think Londos understood that. So he was mad as a wet hen at the way he'd been double-crossed in Chicago. Unlike a lot of other folks, the way he went about rectifying it was to work even harder, make more appearances, try and get people on his side. And he did. He rallied people to his side. Joe Stetcher called him the gamest man he'd ever met, which was quite a commendation coming from them.
But again, this would be something that would derail and sink a lot of guys. I mean, Londos had so much adversity and so many things put up against him.
Yeah, he had everything.
Why was that a fact like that? I mean, why the screw job, and why was he looked at it? It was just too powerful and of a man in the business, or in the other guy's opinion, or what was that? What was?
Boy, yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. We referred to Frankie Kane earlier. Frankie told me one time, based on his wisdom over the years, which are tremendous, promoters would never again let someone get as powerful as Jim Londos, to where a wrestler was running the show. And they resented his power, resented his drawing card ability. It wasn't a matter of appearances. He'd appear anywhere. But yeah, they couldn't.
He controlled the terms because he was the most powerful guy. And promoters, a lot of promoters, the egos are the size of the freaking universe. They can't handle that.
I made a reference. I have a piece coming in on Slam Wrestling about this too, but I'll preview it here. You remember the story of Jason and the Argonauts? Jason was the young Greek lad deprived of his rightful part of the kingdom, and he had to go rescue the Golden Fleece on a voyage across troubled waters. It's kind of like Londos. He was going across troubled waters to rescue his own Golden Fleece, which was a golden championship belt in his case. And Londos, or Jason rather, met all these terrible creatures along the way, Scylla and Charybdis, these creatures who wanted nothing more than to tear you to pieces, wreck your boat, and eat you. Okay? Wrestling promoters of the 1920s had nothing on these guys. Nothing. Wrestling promoters were just as bad as anything Jason and the Argonauts encountered on their voyages across the ocean. They were as underhanded and as duplicitous and as self-concerned and as unaware of the long-term consequences of what they were doing as anybody.
That's what amazes me. They're unaware of the long-term consequences. I mean, they're literally, like we were talking before, the old Southern saying, penny rich and dollar poor. You know, the guys are just goofs. That they want what happens. They don't think about what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or the following year based on their consequences. They're just trying to get through this hour.
It is. And when they treated Londos like the monsters treated Jason of Jason the Argonauts, all they managed to do was go to their own watery grave. Londos remained resilient, came back. Jack Curley and Billy Sandow and other promoters could have just sat back and enjoyed the ride. They would have made just as much money. Of course, they wouldn't have had that seeming level of control in what they did. And that's a very difficult thing to explain now. There's actual companies and federations in control of wrestling. But that was an incredible battle that Londos fought. And in the end, he was the most influential guy. He had the fans on his side, and he was the last one standing.
And there you have it, folks. Steve Johnson just defined this podcast by bringing in Greek mythology. What other podcast in the country can you hear these Greek stories that we're expanding on today? Thank you, Steve.
That's right. That, Mr. Brisco, that is why we are the best. And Steve Johnson has written the greatest book in the history of the wrestling. Did you get my name on there? My name.
He almost reached the legend of a Greek myth, though. The Greeks would, in the Greek press, Greek authors, Greek journalists would fabricate stories of him defeating monsters and defeating gorillas single-handedly. That's how impressive his performances were back to the home folks in Greece. And I mentioned earlier, my friend from Greece, Vicky Moutsari, found some of those and translated some of those for me, where legitimate Greek newspapers had stories about Londos in the wilds of Africa, bringing a gorilla to his knees with an arm bar.
I love it.
That's great.
So you can hulk up all you want, but until you've done that, you have not reached the pinnacle of wrestling.
So you could actually say in Greek, he was looked upon as one of the ancient Greek gods of our universe then.
Yeah, he was. The phraseology, I used some of it in the book. I won't spoil that part. The words with which he was regarded were close to religious. It was clear that for a long period of time, he was emblematic of all the hopes and aspirations of not just Greek wrestling fans, not just Greek sports fans, but of Greek citizens. He was Greece's representative to the outside world.
It's
did
almost
he feel that way too, Steve? I mean, did he feel like he had the weight of the country on his shoulder, or was he kind of just a free?
Yeah, he did. He did. The very first time he wrestled in Greece in 1928, we found a descriptive passage that Vicky helped me with, where he walked into the ring, and for the first time in his life, he felt nervous in a wrestling ring. And it wasn't just the bad weather or the inclement conditions. He realized that he was representing something more than a guy just going to wrestle his opponent at that time, who was Carl Zbyszko. So he definitely felt the weight of everything there on him, the weight of his own hopes, and the weight of his father's concerns, and also the weight of his countrymen's concerns.
Now, you know, one thing, I'm disgruntled with his father. When did they actually make amends on his first trip back to Greece, or did they become like?
No, it wasn't until 1933, his second trip to Greece, that they really broke the ice and became father and son. And I'll spoil this because I've used this in other places as well. But Londos had this wonderful tour of Greece in 1933, the 90,000 people watching him at the stadium in victory, touring the country. And there was a picture taken of Londos, a couple of his, a brother, a cousin, and his father. Just an old black and white photo. His father at that time was pushing 80. And in the photo, which is reproduced in the book, his father's wearing sunglasses. You can't really see what his father's thinking. Londos, of course, is smiling straight ahead like he had a million times before for the camera. And there's a copy of this picture that is kept by Jim's daughter out at her house. I was fortunate to be able to go out there and actually look at this picture. And I turned the picture over, and the writing on the back of the picture is in Jim's handwriting. And he had a very angular, sharp handwriting, probably from the way he'd learned to write as a youth. And on the back of this picture of Jim and his father is written in his own handwriting, "My father in Athens in 1933, when he told me I was his son."
Wow.
And I looked at that picture and I got chills. I scanned it then.
And what's amazing is it meant so much to him that he wrote it on the picture.
Yeah, that was, if the victory against Lewis in the match of the century was the culmination of his career, that moment in Athens in 1933 was the culmination maybe of his personal life and his relationship with his father. his long estranged father.
Yeah. That's incredible. And that's a kid's almost lifelong journey to find that validation from his dad.
Yeah, he's within the period of a year, he's been validated by his father, and he's been validated by beating Lewis. That's a pretty darn good year.
Yeah. One thing I thought about, and it's a very small microcosm of what Londos did, but The Rock versus Hogan in Toronto for SummerSlam. The thought is I guarantee you take 1,000 wrestlers, 999 would have turned heel. But they said, okay, I'm going with the crowd. I'm going to turn heel. The Rock knew enough to know it was a global audience to not turn heel, because even though that was the right thing to do for the local crowd, it was the wrong thing to do for a global audience. Very similar, Londos never took the short-term gratification of getting back at these promoters. It was the long-term, I'm going to be the guy that is going to be the representative of Greece. I'm going to be the guy that's representative of people out there. And he never fought back. Its success was his revenge.
It was. And I want to mention this too, that's in the book, because I didn't realize this before, but we want to talk about things that have consequences 100 years later. Jim Londos invented a hold that he called the anesthetic headlock. You know what we call that now? That's the sleeper, baby.
Wow.
Ed White, his manager, called it the sleeper. Jim Londos, how many kids have applied the sleeper hold to their little brother in the living room where their mother's yelling at him, "Are you wrestling again? Are you wrestling again?" That's all traceable back to Jim Londos.
Wow.
Wow.
He didn't use it as a knockout hold. He used it to stun the guy for a pinfall. So it wasn't quite the way that Gagne or Whipper Watson would use it. But yeah, Jim Londos and the sleeper hold, if he did nothing else in wrestling, that alone would deserve him to have some kind of entry in Pro Wrestling Illustrated.
That's right. Was it Stetcher with the headlock?
Lewis started the headlock. The headlock. Stetcher was the leg scissors.
Leg scissors, right.
And Londos
Strangler Lewis had that's the stranglehold, the headlock that he would use.
Hence the name Strangler, John.
Yeah. So if you take those three holds,
damn Texans, Steve, you got to deal with this Texans on a different time. I'm sorry.
If you take those three holds,
can I cut your mic?
Yeah, twice already today.
If you take those three holds, Lewis with the headlock, Stetcher with the leg scissors, Londos with the sleeper hold, you've got the basis of wrestling right there.
Yeah,
that's right. Well, Steve, the book is Jim Londos, about the greatest draw of all time, the greatest wrestler of all time, in my opinion, the Golden Greek in professional wrestling. Did we miss anything with the Londos story?
I could have written probably twice as much, but then again, we can't have books 600 or 700 pages and that take a week and a half to read. It was a little bit, just from a journalistic standpoint, it's a little bit tricky to try and write stuff that's both appealing to wrestling insiders and also to folks from Greece who don't know anything about this guy. When you get into writing about championship lines and championship lineages, it can get a little bit tricky. But I think one of the comments from one of the reviewers was, I didn't want Londos to die so I could keep reading about him, which was such a sweet thing to say.
It is.
I appreciate that so much. And I've been telling people, don't buy the book for the part that I wrote about Londos. Buy the book for the forward. The forward is absolutely awesome. Because you've done such a great job of tying together all these strands that we talked about wrestling 100 years ago and wrestling today and championships and how it feels to have the weight of the business on your shoulders. It fits just perfectly. I know I've told you that in private, but I wanted to say it on the podcast as well.
It was a terrific honor, and thank you for letting me do it. I got the book. I've read it a couple of times in digital form, but you sent us me and Mr. Briscoe the book, and so I took it on my last weekend trip with me, and the pictures in it are just amazing. There's the part of the airplane spin. I spent the whole day on the plane. Guys had to look at me like, this big bastard can't read, because I'm just sitting there looking at the pictures and just sitting there. I'd go to the next picture. I'm reading the book. I didn't tell people I've already read it twice, but the pictures were awesome.
Yeah, you almost have to read it twice. I can't tell you how many drafts I went through, 20 or 30, but you almost have to read it 2 or 3 times because the level of detail in there is a lot, and something might not
It is.
register with you the first time you see it, and then you go back after having read the whole story, and you say, "Oh, I see now where that fits."
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time on that, and just the personal note, the last 2 or 3 paragraphs in the book, the last section, which people can read on their own, I spent a lot of time on because I wanted to do a good job having people understand what wrestling really is all about.
Yeah.
One last question from me. We mentioned the daughter there. The daughter's still alive, and she lives in California. How open is she? I mean, what kind of memory does she have of her father?
2 daughters, one in California, one in Colorado. They never saw him wrestle. He got married relatively late in life, and his youngest daughter, Christine, was born in 1955. She was a great source for the book. She opened up so many things to me so that I could actually see his tax return, his federal tax return from 1919. Okay.
Wow.
Which just helps to describe a little bit here and there. She's done a wonderful job helping me with him. She was in Iowa a few years ago when Jim was inducted into the Hall of Fame out in Waterloo.
Right.
But one of the real joys of this is I've told her and her sister Dee Dee a lot of things that they didn't know about their father, because they were not of an age where you sit down with your parents and kind of debrief their entire life to try and understand who they were and where they were coming from. So that's been a joy and a pleasure, is sending them a little tidbit about
Daddy. She was probably thrilled to find out things about her father that she didn't know, that you, through your research, were able to share with her, right?
Yeah, and it thrilled me too to be able to send her something and say, here's what your dad did, and you didn't know about it, but it made a significant impact on this person or that person's life.
And what type of memorabilia do they have from their father? Do they have programs, or they have what
Yeah, programs, clippings, and the big item would be a world championship belt that none of us are going to ever be able to hold into our hands.
Did you get a picture of it at least?
I have a picture of I don't think I put it in the book because I wasn't taking good pictures the day I was out there. Yeah, they have his world championship. One of his daughters has the world championship belt, which I believe is, if anybody out there is suspicious, it's in a safety deposit box, so you're not going to get at it, and that's where it should stay.
Wow.
But I would think in terms of the holy grail of wrestling memorabilia, that would have to be up there, very close to the top.
Wow. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And you've seen it.
Yeah.
Wow.
That is cool.
Is it everything you could visualize? I mean, from a 1930s world championship belt. I mean, because I love seeing old school championship belts, whether they be boxing.
I tell you, my first thought is this is not as ornate and huge as the skull world championship or the spinner world championships. This is kind of almost it's modest and simplistic. It's made of real metal. Okay. It's but this is the real deal. And this has survived 100 years ago, and this was considered the most important thing you could have in sports, and here it is.
Wow. That is cool.
It is pretty cool.
Well, Steve, thank you very much. The book, Jim Londos, the way this show, I think, was coming out, it's going to be available. The minute you see this show, you're able to go on, I guess, Amazon and everything and buy this book wherever you normally buy books, right?
Sure. I made it easy for folks. There's a website called londosbook.com that has some stuff in it that I couldn't fit in the book, but it has all the information. You can buy it from mcfarlandbooks.com, the publisher. They have a discount between now and December 31st. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, I'm sure your local bookstore can get it for you in a day or two if you want to go that route. So yeah, mcfarlandbooks.com, londosbook.com, look for it on Amazon, look for it anywhere. I appreciate feedback. One of the great things about doing this project was reaching out to people who would email me back and say, I didn't know about Jim Londos, but I mentioned his name to my grandfather, and my grandfather just started going head over heels that he'd seen Jim Londos in Kansas City when he was 9 years old, and he'll never forget it. So as is the case with a lot of wrestlers, you make an impression on people that you never will even know about.
Right.
So what do you have coming up, Steve? You have any new projects coming up?
I do have. Thank you for mentioning that. Greg Oliver and I have the first in a series of books from Slam Wrestling coming up probably in March, which will be a sort of a collection of some of the best of things that we've done for Slam, as well as a lot of new material, updated, fresh stories, much along the lines of the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame series that we did. And then I'm working on another book. It may be a couple of years in the making. We'll need to talk about at some point, but it involves a wrestler who had a white streak like a skunk down the middle of his head.
Martin Monroe.
Yeah. You want to talk about characters?
Oh,
We can talk about him.
Yeah.
Talk about him for a
Yes.
while.
yeah. How far you want to go, kid? Well, I'm just going down here at the corner, get off at the corner down there. No, I'm talking about how far you want to go fighting. That was one of the comments he made to me one night. How far you want to go, kid? I thought he meant I was in the car with him. I thought he meant I was driving me. He's going to drop me off somewhere. Thought he's going to pull over in the middle of Conway, Arkansas and drop me off one day.
Well, we'll be getting into him over the course of the next year at Iowa and at Cauliflower Alley, because he's another guy who not only is a character, but he did some things in terms of society that need to be.
He did some things, you know, with,
Terrific things.
segregation like that was unheard of in Tennessee.
Sputnik was the real deal.
Unheard of in the United States at the time he was doing them. So
Hey, the story of him getting knocked out by the cowboy alone is worth the book.
That's right. So we'll be working on that. That's probably a couple of years off at the rate that I'm going, but I'm going to try and finish that one a little faster than I finished the Londos book.
Well, Greg Oliver, we both love Greg, but he doesn't quite get our sense of humor. So we we tried to explain to him that hockey didn't start in Canada; it started in Florida, and he doesn't quite agree with us on any of that. I'm not sure why he doesn't agree with us, and he quit texting us back after a while. So I'm not sure why. I must have lost our number or something.
He lost our number, John. I'm sure
that's what it was.
I'm sure Steve will get us back into good graces again.
Please get us back in the graces of Greg Oliver. We didn't mean what we said about hockey.
We love Greg. We love Greg.
We love Greg.
Slam
Greg
Wrestling does tremendous things.
Yep, we apologize, Greg.
No, we don't.
There's no apologies in wrestling because, as we said earlier, no final defeats, no final victories.
That's right. Listen to that, Greg. Listen to that, Greg. Forgive us. We're sorry. Hey, Steve, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, guys. I appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you guys a little bit later on in 2025.